On behalf of the University of Chicago Law School and the Abrams Environmental Law Clinic, I'd like to welcome you all to the law school today to hear from one of our country's leading environmental visionaries and advocates. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is one of the nation's most committed and successful defenders of the environment. He serves in a number of capacities, including as the senior attorney for the National Resources Defense Council, the chief prosecuting attorney for the Hudson River Keeper, the president-at-large of the Waterkeeper Alliance, a partner of the clean tech investment team of Silicon Valley's Vantage Point Capital Ventures, the environmental advisor to Napo Pharmaceuticals, and in his spare time, he's also a professor of environmental law at Pace University School of Law and serves as the co-director of the school's environmental litigation clinic. And any one of us would know every one of those things that he does is a full-time job. So earlier in his career, he served as assistant district attorney in New York City. Mr. Kennedy was named one of Time Magazine's Heroes for the Planet for his success in helping Riverkeeper New York's Riverkeeper, which is New York's preeminent clean water advocate, lead the fight to restore the Hudson River. The group's achievement helped spawn more than 160 waterkeeper organizations around the globe. He's written several books, among them the New York Times bestseller Crimes Against Nature, published in 2004, The River Keepers, published in 1997, and Judge Frank M. Johnson Jr. biography, published in 1977. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, LA Times, Wall Street Journal, and I could go on and on and on. We are especially grateful that he's here today through the generosity of Wendy and Jim Abrams, who also have been instrumental in creating our first environmental law clinic in the not the United States, but at the University of Chicago, which of course, for our intents and purposes, is the United States. We want more. So in any event, I'd like you all to join me in welcoming Robert F. Kennedy.
First of all, I want to apologize for my voice, which I hope will get stronger as I talk. But I want to talk particularly since this is the University of Chicago, it's famous for its advocacy of free market capitalism. And I've said for 25 years as an environmental advocate that when people ask me what's the most important thing that could happen to the environment, I've always said the same thing, that if we had true free market capitalism in this country, which I don't believe that we have. I was talking with Jim Hightower the other day, who's a populist from Texas, and I was talking about the free market, and I said the free market, and he agreed with me. He said, yeah, the free market is a great thing. We should try it sometime. And the reason that free market, no, actually, let me talk a little bit about that later and just give you some kind of examples. I got into the environmental racket working for fishermen on the Hudson River, for small commercial fishermen, and we have the oldest commercial fishery on the Hudson River in North America. It's 350 years old, and many of the people I represent come from families that have been fishing the river continuously since Dutch colonial times. So they were small business people. They understood something that I also felt innately, which was that we're not protecting the environment so much for the sake of the fishes and the birds. We're protecting it for our own sake, because we recognize that nature is the infrastructure of our communities, that if we want to meet our obligation as a generation, as a civilization, as a nation, which is to create communities for our children that provide them with the same opportunities for dignity and enrichment and prosperity and good health, as the communities that our parents gave us, we've got to start by protecting our environmental infrastructure. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, those things that are not susceptible to private property ownership, but by their nature are the assets of the entire community, what we call the commons or the public trust assets, the rivers, the shorelines, the aquifers, the public lands that connect us to our past, to our history, that provide context to our communities, and that are the source ultimately of our values and virtues and our character as a people. One of the mantras that you'll hear continuously from the big polluters and their indentured servants and the political process on Capitol Hill and at Fox News and on talk radio, et cetera, is this idea that we have to choose between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. And that is a false choice. I would argue that in 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy if we want to measure our economy. And this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations, over the long term, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. If, on the other hand, we want to do what the polluters want us to do, which is like the Koch brothers or Exxon, the people who are funding the Tea Party, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy, but our children are going to pay for our joyride, and they're going to pay for it, and we can make a few people billionaires by impoverishing the rest of us. But our children are going to pay for it with denuded landscapes and poor health and huge cleanup costs that are going to amplify over time and that they'll never be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the costs of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children. And one of the things that I've done over the past 3 decades as an environmental advocate is to constantly go around and confront this argument that an investment in our environment is a diminishment of our nation's wealth. It doesn't diminish our wealth. It's an investment in infrastructure. The same as investing in telecommunications or road construction or canal systems or railroad systems, what have you. It's an investment we have to make if we're going to ensure the economic vitality of our generation and of future generations. Now, the biggest crises that we face as a civilization, and you can look, almost all of them are rooted in how we use energy, whether it's global warming or whether it's Fukushima or whether it's the BP oil spill or the war in Iraq or the mining accidents that you read about daily from West Virginia to China, the chaotic weather, all of these other things. They're all rooted, almost all of the major problems are rooted in how we use energy. And the question is, can we use energy? And we have to use it. It provides the prosperity to our communities. Can we use it in a way that, can we extract it? Can we deploy it? Can we distribute it? And can we utilize it in ways that don't diminish our quality of life, doesn't compromise the aspirations of future generations? It doesn't get us into foreign wars and diminish our moral authority, our global moral authority, diminish our leadership throughout the world. And I would answer that question in the affirmative. Lord David Putnam gave a speech. Can you guys hear me in the way back there? Lord David Putnam gave a speech before Parliament in November, when Parliament was debating a cap and trade system that's very similar to the one that we passed in the United States Congress. It was called the Waxman-Markey Bill 2 years ago, and it was then killed by the oil industry in the Senate. And it was the cornerstone of Barack Obama's energy policy. And to its credit, Parliament ultimately passed the bill. Their bill was much, much tougher. And the bill was it's like a no-brainer. It was actually, the system was dreamt up by the right wing of the Republican Party, and it was a way to impose cap and trade. It was a way to impose free market logic onto the disposal of carbon. Right now, if you want to get rid of carbon, you dump it into our commons, which you and I own. Our air, our water, what have you. And the cap and trade system was just a way of saying, okay, we're going to devise a system for disposing of carbon that incentivizes good behavior, that incentivizes entrepreneurial activity, entrepreneurs to develop new ways or innovative ways of reducing the amount of carbon that energy uses, and then to reward that, to reward the adaptation of those kind of technologies. We killed it here. In England, they passed it, but in England, virtually everybody accepts the science behind global warming. They haven't been deluged, as we have in this country, by $200 million propaganda campaign funded by the Koch brothers, by Exxon, by the American Petroleum Institute over the past 20 years to persuade Americans that there's scientific doubt about global warming. So in England, everybody recognized the science. They understand they look at this as a grim reality that government has to take a strong hand in addressing. But there are vested interests in others who say, well, we have to move slowly, we have to move incrementally, because if we move precipitously, it's going to cause grave dislocations in the market. And that's going to impede our capacity to address this and other issues. And Lord Putnam was addressing the concerns of that cohort. And he reminded Parliament that exactly 200 years before, the same body had debated the abolition of the slave trade. And at that time in England, virtually everybody opposed slavery. They saw it as an abomination, a moral catastrophe. It had to be abolished. The question was, how do you do it? Because slavery represented 25% of the GNP of Great Britain. It was the principal source of energy for the entire British Empire, free human labor. And the question was, the concern was, if you abolish it outright, that the economy would crater. But after a year of debate, Parliament made the moral choice and abolished slavery literally overnight. And instead of collapsing, the British economy exploded as thousands of entrepreneurs rushed into that space to create new forms of energy, mainly mechanical ones, in an era that we now know as the Industrial Revolution, which was the greatest epic in wealth creation in the history of mankind. And the abolition of the slave trade had exposed all of these hidden inefficiencies that were associated with free human bondage. Well, today, we don't need to abolish carbon to understand that our deadly addiction to it is the principal drag on American capitalism. We are borrowing in our country $1 billion a day, as T. Boone Pickens will tell you, mainly from nations that don't share our values, in order to import $1 billion of oil a day, again, largely from nations that don't share values. Some of them are outright hostile to us. We are, in essence, funding both sides of the war against terror through our addiction to oil. And this hemorrhage of $750 billion, $700 billion, $750 billion annually of American wealth has beggared a nation that, when I was a little boy, owned half the wealth on the face of the planet. We give every year to the oil industry. There's a mature, the wealthiest industry in the history of mankind. Last quarter, Exxon made $145 billion in profits a day. They don't need subsidies. But we give hundreds of billions of subsidies to this industry every year. We give many direct federal subsidies, about $55 billion with the oil depletion allowance, many of them written into the tax code, the depreciation of equipment, the suspension of royalties on federal lands, et cetera. But most of them are indirect subsidies. The $100 billion we spend annually protecting our oil companies' infrastructure in the Arabian Gulf, The damage to crops, the damage to human health, about $300 billion a year from benzene, toluene, xylene, and these other emissions from oil. Terry Tamminen, who just stepped down as head of California EPA, has done a meticulous, scrupulous calculation of the total amount of subsidies that we give to big oil each year, and it's about, his number is about $1.3 trillion. He's written a book about it called Lives Per Gallon, a very, very good book. And his number, I think, is very conservative. He doesn't look at the BP oil spill. He doesn't factor in the Mideast wars, which are, of course, should be billed to their account. We give about $500 billion every year in subsidies to the nuke industry. We give about, nobody really knows. This actually would be a good idea for a paper because all this is public information, but nobody's ever done a good calculation of how much we give to the coal industry every year in direct and indirect subsidies, but it's well over $1 trillion. This is, coal claims to be cheap and clean. When they say they're clean, we know that's a dirty lie. When they say they're cheap, it's also a lie. It's actually, if they had to internalize the true cost of doing business, it would be the most catastrophically expensive way to boil a pot of water that's ever been devised. I spent a lot of my time over the past 30 years suing the coal industry and coal burning utilities. And I was in West Virginia 2 years ago, and I had a 6.5-week jury trial in this state. And in the end, we won the biggest judgment in the history of the state. It was later essentially dismantled by the West Virginia Supreme Court, which is just a subsidiary of the coal industry in the state. And it will effectively keep my kind of lawyer, at least mass tort and class action lawyers, that decision out of that state forever. While I was out arguing the appeal of that decision about a year ago in front of the West Virginia Supreme Court, and as I was leaving the state, we were driving on a highway that felt like it was like a skateboard park. It was so smooth, and it was like a cushion. And this is unusual in West Virginia. My father used to say it's the richest state in the country if you look at the minerals below the ground, but it's got the poorest population, the second poorest after Mississippi. Because coal doesn't bring prosperity to a state. It's what we call the resource curse. It brings poverty, and it brings tyranny, and it destroys democracy anywhere where you see these big concentration of resources. And I said to the driver, why is this road so smooth? And he said, because there's 22 inches of asphalt on this road. Well, the Massachusetts Turnpike is about 4 to 6. The New York State Thruway is 6 to 8 inches, and every inch of asphalt costs millions of dollars per lane, per mile to the taxpayer. So I knew why there was 22 inches of asphalt, because the coal trucks weigh 90,000 pounds, and they'll pulverize a less robust road. But it's not the coal industry that's paying for that road. That was a federal highway, and it's you and I that are paying for it. So that's the cost of coal that they don't tell you about when they say, oh, it's only 11 cents a kilowatt hour. There's 3,000 miles of coal roads in West Virginia, and most of them are state roads or county roads, but they're being paid for by the taxpayer, not the coal industry. In August of last year, the National Academy of Science issued a 10-year study that showed that every freshwater fish in America now has dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh. The mercury is coming from coal-burning power plants. We're living in a science fiction nightmare in this country today. My children and the children of Illinois and virtually all the children in America can now no longer engage in the seminal primal activity of American youth, which is to go fishing with their father and mother in the local fishing hole and then come home and safely eat the fish, because the political clout of the coal industry has allowed them to get this subsidy for themselves and violate not only free market capitalism, but also the democratic process and destroy, our Purple Mountain's majesty and our amber waves of grain and the fishes and the waterways that we all hold dear. And according to CDC, 1 out of every 6 American women in this country now has dangerous levels of mercury in her womb from eating those fish. Dangerous enough to cause high enough to cause the loss in her child of at least 1 IQ point, permanent loss, and a grim inventory of other diseases: autism, blindness, mental retardation, heart, liver, and kidney disease. I spent a lot of time fishing, and I eat a lot of the fish. And I got my mercury levels tested recently. My levels are 10 times what EPA considers safe. I was told by Dr. David Carpenter, who's a national authority on mercury contamination, that a woman with my levels of mercury in her blood would have children with cognitive impairment, with permanent brain injury. And I said to him, she might have. And he said, no, the science is very certain today. Her children would have some level of permanent brain damage. And he said, probably with my levels of mercury, a permanent IQ loss in those kids of about 5 to 7 points. Well, today, according to CDC, there are 640,000 children born in this country every year who've been exposed to dangerous levels of mercury in their mother's wombs. And that's a cost of coal that, again, they don't tell you about when they say it's only 11 cents a kilowatt hour. If you go onto your computers, hopefully after you leave this lecture, maybe in Dr. Epstein's class, and look at EPA's website, you'll see a host of studies there. One of them by the Harvard School of Public Health, but a bunch of peer-reviewed studies that show that ozone and particulates, which is another class of pollutants from coal-burning power plants, kill 47 to 60,000 Americans a year. That's 20 times the number of people who were killed in the World Trade Center attack. The healthcare costs from respiratory illnesses from those two vectors or parameters is about $345 billion. Just the stuff that's coming from coal-burning power plants specifically. $345 billion. We could pay for Obamacare, 6 or 7 times over, just by eliminating those pollutants from coal-burning power plants. That's subsidy to big coal. 10 million asthma attacks a year, 1 million lost work days. These are all costs that they don't tell you about when they say it's 11 cents a kilowatt hour. I live 2 hours south of the Appalachian Mountains, out of the Adirondack Mountains, and I take my kids fishing and hunting and camping and skiing and hiking up there. This is the oldest protected wilderness on Earth. It's been protected as forever wild since 1888. Today, 1/5 of the lakes in the Adirondacks is sterilized from acid rain. And that acid rain is coming from the same coal-burning power plants, and it has destroyed, incidentally, also the forest cover on the high peaks of the Appalachians from Georgia to northern Quebec. Not just public timber stands, but private ones as well. So it is, and that's an attack on our economy, and it's an attack on America's wealth, and it's something we all pay for, but they don't tell you about when they say it's 11 cents a kilowatt hour. And I could go on with these hidden costs all day. But I'll just tell you about one more. When I flew out over the Appalachians, I flew over the Cumberland Plateau, which I've done many times over the past 3 decades, and I saw something that if the American people could see it, I believe there'd be a revolution in this country. We are literally cutting down the Appalachian Mountains. These historic landscapes where Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett come from, and so much of our culture, from NASCAR racing to bluegrass music, comes from these, from these mountains. We're cutting them down with these giant machines called drag lines. They're 22 stories high. They cost $500 million for a single machine. I flew under one of them in a Piper Cub, and they practically dispense with the need for human labor, which indeed is the point. When my father was fighting strip mining in Appalachia back in the 60s, and back then, the strips were minuscule compared to what they're doing today. I remember a conversation I had with him when I was 14 years old, where he said to me, they're not just destroying the mountains and the environment. They're permanently destroying those communities because there's no way that they can regenerate an economy from these barren moonscapes that are left behind. And he said they're doing it so they can break the unions. And that's exactly what they did. When he told me that, there were 151,000 unionized mine workers in West Virginia digging coal out of tunnels in the ground. Today, there are fewer than 14,000 miners in the state. Most of them are not unionized because the strip industry broke the UMW. And they're taking that, so 9 out of 10 miners is gone, but they're taking more coal out of West Virginia than they were in 1968. And the difference is back then they were leaving at least some of that wealth in the state for salaries and pensions and reinvestment in the community. Today, virtually all of it's going straight up to Wall Street. To the big banking houses like JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, and Citibank that fund these operations, and to the out-of-state companies, because they're all out of state. Massey Coal, Consol, and Peabody, which own virtually all the coal in the state of West Virginia. 95% of the coal in West Virginia is owned by out-of-state interests. And they are liquidating the state for cash, using these giant machines and 2,500 tons of ammonium nitrate explosives they detonate every day in West Virginia. It's the equivalent of a Hiroshima bomb once a week. They're blowing the tops off the mountains to get at the coal seams beneath, and they take the rock, debris, rubble, and they scrape it into the adjacent river valley and bury the rivers. According to EPA, over the past 10 years, they've cut down, flattened the 500 biggest mountains in West Virginia. They have flattened an area larger than the state of Delaware, 1.4 million acres of our Appalachian Mountains. They buried 2,200 miles of rivers and streams and poisoned thousands more. And this is all illegal. You cannot in the United States take rock and debris and rubble and dump it into a waterway without a Clean Water Act permit. And you can never get a permit to do such a thing. So we sued them, and we sued them in front of a conservative Republican federal judge, Judge Charles Hayden. And Judge Hayden said the same thing I did. It's all illegal. It's been illegal since day one, and he enjoined all mountaintop mining. 2 days from when we got that decision, lobbyists from Massey Coal and Peabody Coal met in the back door of Gail Norton's Interior Department with her first deputy chief, Stephen J. Griles, who was a former lobbyist for Massey Coal and Peabody Coal, and who is now serving a 10.5-month jail sentence in the federal penitentiary, but too late for the Mountaintops because they rewrote the interpretation of one word of the Clean Water Act, the definition of the word fill, to change 30 years of statutory interpretation and make it legal as it is today, not just in West Virginia, but in Illinois and every other state, to dump rock, debris, rubble, garbage, any solid material into any waterway of the United States without a Clean Water Act permit. All you need today is a rubber stamp permit from the Corps of Engineers, which in some districts you can get over the telephone or through the mail. So, and this is why I always say, wherever you see the large-scale destruction of the environment, you'll also see the subversion of American democracy. And West Virginia is, the template, the poster child for the destruction of democracy. It is a company town. In West Virginia, you don't have planning laws and zoning laws that the rest of us assume, which give us the capacity to have some sovereignty over the destiny of our communities. These are the basic democratic governing tools in a democracy, locally based democracy. But in West Virginia, if you try to zone out mountaintop removal mining, because they're poisoning the kids and dropping rocks on people's houses and poisoning the streams. You said, we don't want that in our community. You couldn't do it. It's against the law. You can't stop somebody from coming and you have no property rights. You can't stop somebody from coming in and plowing up your yard in order to get the coal underneath. You can't, the transparency is gone from government. Everything is done in secret. The agencies that are supposed to protect us for Americans from pollution have been captured. They become sock puppets for the industry that they're supposed to regulate, for the coal industry. And they've corrupted virtually well, I won't say virtually, I'll say every politician in the state of West Virginia, because in West Virginia, 85% of the people of the state, by every poll, shows that 85% of the people of the state want mountaintop removal mining to end it. But not a single politician in the state will say that out loud, and neither will any newspaper, because the press has been corrupted too, and that's an easy thing to do. If you're the only source of advertising, and you can keep other industries out of the state, which is what they do, and they keep people out. If you go into, I don't want to spend that much more time on this, but I've been to 30 towns in West Virginia where there are no people. They keep saying we're bringing prosperity in West Virginia, but what they come into those towns, they tell the people, you got to move. If you don't move, we're going to be dropping toxic dust all over you. We'll pay you, but when you sign the contract, you have to agree to never move back to this county again. So they're emptying the landscapes of people and industrializing America's landscapes. And that, broad spread ownership of land was one of the things that Jefferson said was the basis of American democracy. And democracy it's just disappeared in West Virginia. So, and that's one of the costs of coal, again, that they don't tell you about. And that's a cost that's much more difficult to reduce to dollars and cents, but nevertheless, it is a cost that every American is going to end up paying. And with the Citizens United case now, what's happened in West Virginia is now the future of the rest of our country. Where we are on our way to becoming a company town for these large corporate kleptocracy. And these subsidies to coal give that industry a huge advantage in the marketplace, so that we don't have true free market capitalism in the energy sector. It's really, it's corporate crony capitalism. It's the subsidy of the incumbents that keep much more efficient forms of energy out of the marketplace. We know this, that every nation that has decarbonized its society has experienced instantaneous prosperity and wealth. Iceland in 1970 decided to decarbonize its society. At that time, it was the poorest country in Europe. They really wanted to get rid of carbon. They were 100% dependent on imported coal and oil. They wanted to get rid of it because they were frightened of global warming, which impacts the northern latitudes disproportionately. And again, there were naysayers, and people say we have to go slowly, but Iceland moved very deliberately. Within 15 years, they had completely decarbonized, and Iceland today gets 95% of its energy from geothermal, local geothermal. But it went during that period from being the poorest country in Europe to being the fourth richest country by GDP on Earth. Now, unfortunately for Iceland, they spent virtually all of their newfound wealth on bundled derivatives, and they are once again the poorest country in Europe. But Iceland's economy will rebound. It already is. It's because it has strong fundamentals. Iceland today is one of the world's greater energy exporters. It can't run lines across the Atlantic, although it soon will be able to, because Great Britain is building giant wind farms in the North Sea that are close enough that Iceland's going to be able to connect directly onto the European grid and sell its energy. It's these vast surpluses that they have geothermal, and they're going to get very, very, very wealthy at that point. But today, they import bauxite from Jamaica, smelt the bauxite, use the surpluses of geothermal to smelt the bauxite into aluminum. They sell the ingots in the real world market, and that's their way of exporting energy. Sweden in 1997 decided to decarbonize its society, and incidentally, to shut down its nuclear power plants and close the two biggest nuke plants, slapped a $150 ton tax on carbon. And Sweden, since then, and again, you had tens of thousands of entrepreneurs rushing into that space to create new forms of energy, from wind, from tidal, from solar, from geothermal, from putrid garbage and sawmill waste. And today, Sweden, since '97, Sweden's economy has grown by 45%, while its energy use has dropped by 9%. Brazil, 20 years ago decarbonized its transportation system, and as a direct result of that choice, Brazil, while the entire world economy kind of spirals and collapses, Brazil is enjoying the longest, most robust economic expansion in the history of Latin America. Brazil this year replaced France as the 5th wealthiest country on earth. Costa Rica at the same time decarbonized its electric grid, and as a result of that choice and other things, but Costa Rica is really a kind of an exemplar for good government. It made a lot of really good choices that have helped that country enormously, the economy. One of them was to not have an army. Costa Rica today, which is one of the smallest countries in Central America, has by far the largest economy. It's larger than almost all of its neighbors combined. So Costa Rica, and you can go on and on with these examples, but we have in our country much greater geothermal resources than they have in Iceland. We have, my home in Mount Kisco, New York is powered by geothermal, and virtually every home outside of the major cities in our country could be. Almost nobody does it because of the illusion that coal provides cheaper energy. It doesn't. If coal had to internalize, it would be far more expensive than geothermal. Because of the subsidies, they're sending bad signals out into the marketplace. We have, according to the Scientific American, we're number 3 in terms of solar energy. The Scientific American just did a report that showed you could power the entire U.S. energy grid from an area 75 miles by 75 miles in the desert Southwest. We're number 1 in wind energy in the world. And the Great Plains states are kind of the Saudi Arabia of wind. North Dakota is the windiest place on earth at sea level. We have enough, according to the Scientific American, we have enough harnessable wind in Montana, North Dakota, and Texas to provide 100% of our energy grid 3 times over, even if every American owned an electric car. The challenge, we have a couple of challenges. We have an administration that wants to transition to a new energy economy and is doing it bit by bit. They wanted to do it dramatically, but they've had to do it through the agencies and the regulatory process rather than through Congress, which, because of the big control that the oil industry and the coal industry and the carbon incumbents have in the United States Congress, and particularly the Senate today. But they have 3 major impediments. One is the giant subsidies to the incumbents that tilt the playing fields in their favor dramatically. Now, I'll say this, and Barack Obama has promised again and again that he's going to abolish the subsidies, the direct subsidies, the direct money like the oil depletion allowance, but he hasn't been able to do it. But even with those subsidies, we are beating them. And the dean said that I'm a partner in the biggest green tech venture capital firm in the country, and so I'm deeply involved in building wind farms, solar farms, LED lights, electric cars, etc. But we're beating them, even with their huge advantage in the marketplace. We're beating them because the price of wind and solar is dropping so dramatically, particularly solar, because the Chinese involvement and because of technological, the pace of technological improvements. The price of solar since last year has dropped by 85%. I had lunch with David Crane about 3 weeks ago, who's the head of NRG, which is the second biggest energy supplier in our country, and they're agnostic about their energy source. He's got coal plants, a huge fleet of gas plants, nuke plants, etc. But he said to me, the future is all solar. Because he said in 20 states today, he can get solar panels from his vendors, which allow him to sell below grid electrons on the marketplace. In other words, cheaper than coal. Within 5 years, in 35 states, solar is going to be cheaper than coal, and with 10 years, 50 states, it's going to be cheaper than coal. So even with their subsidies, we're still beating them in the marketplace. If we had a true free market capitalism, if we got to abolish all the subsidies to the energy domain arena, coal and oil would die overnight, as would nuke. And the second issue that Obama has is, and this is the biggest one, we don't have an energy grid in this country that can carry these new currents of power. Our energy grid is antiquated, it was underbuilt, it's stupid. We need a smart grid. It is misaligned, it doesn't reach the big wind power in the Midwest, the solar power in the Southwest, and it is incapable of doing long-haul transmission of electrons. So today, in, for example, the state of North Dakota, every farmer in the state wants to put wind turbines on their farms. Why? Because a cornfield in North Dakota is worth $800. A cornfield with a wind turbine on it's worth $3,800. So we have the ability, the capacity now to regenerate these declining rural economies, to keep family farmers on their farms, to create jobs in the American hinterland, do a lot of good things. The problem is the North Dakota wind farmer cannot get his electrons to markets in Cincinnati, Cleveland, Columbus, New Orleans, New York, or Chicago, because they will diffuse in the line before they cross the North Dakota border. And what we need to do is to we need a national campaign like Eisenhower launched with the highway system back in the 60s when I was a boy, to connect every American community to a national highway system for the sake of national cohesion, for the sake of commerce, and for the sake of national security, but to do it with an electric system, to connect every American to a unified national grid. Let me ask you something. When do I have to shut up?
So we'll about quarter after 20 after, so if you
Okay.
have some time for questions.
Okay. So, the other thing is this. This is the third thing, is Obama has a regulatory problem. We have a balkanized energy regulatory system in this country with 50 public utility commissions in all the states and 120 control districts, each with their own Byzantine, arcane set of rules that restrict access to the grid. And they're irrational. They don't, the free market capitalism is the most powerful economic engine ever devised. And this is what I think Professor Epstein understands part of this, but not all of it. It's the most powerful, wonderful economic engine ever devised, but it has to be harnessed to a social purpose. Otherwise, it leads us down the road towards plutocracy. And infallibly, that's where it will lead us, if you don't hook it to a social purpose. So what you have to do, and for example, in most of the states in this country, the way that CEOs of public utility commissions make money is by burning as much energy as possible. I have a friend, Jim Rogers, who runs Duke Energy, who has the second largest fleet of coal plants in the country. He hates coal. He knows it's bad. He knows it's destroying, it's threatening civilization, it's poisoning his consumers, and his neighbors. And he wants to shut down all of his plants. But his customers want him to get, or his shareholders want him to get his customers to leave their lights on all night and to leave the refrigerator doors open, because that's how he makes money. So we are putting him in a position, this very smart man, an idealistic man, that every day he has to wake up and decide between his loyalty to our country, to humanity, to civilization, or his duty to his shareholders. And that is a bad thing for us to be doing to smart people like Jim Rogers. So we changed the rules in California, the group that I work for, NRDC. We rewrote the rules so that instead of making money by doing bad things, utility CEOs make money, the same amount of money or more, but by doing good things. So, and this wasn't a radical idea. They make money by getting their consumers to conserve energy or to switch to renewables. It's not a radical notion. Before we had deregulation in this country, the way that utilities made money is by building capital projects. So they would go to the Public Utility Commission, say, I want to build a dam. The dam's going to cost $100 million. I want to make 12% profit per annum, and I want that integrated into the rate base. The PUC, if they could demonstrate a need, the PUC would stamp it approved, and they go ahead and build the dam. Today, the way that the utilities make money in California is they go to the Public Utility Commission and they say, we want to take the Edison light bulbs out of 1 million homes and replace them with LED light bulbs that use 12% of the energy. We want to go into 1 million homes and tear out the hot water boilers and the refrigerators and air conditioners and other appliances and replace them with more efficient models. It's going to cost us $100 million. We want to make 12% profit. And it's going to save a lot more energy than we would create by investing in a bed dam or a power plant. In some cases, 5 to 10 times the amount of energy per dollar. We call that negawatts. You know, by reducing our power is actually a lot cheaper to pay people to reduce power and to create new power. So because in 1982, we rewrote the law in California to make it so that free market capitalism serves society rather than getting rich by doing evil things. Today, Californians use half the energy that everybody else uses in our country. Californians use 6,000 kilowatt hours of energy per year. In Illinois, I think you use probably 11 to some states use 14,000. And because they are using less energy, it makes them more competitive with everybody else. So it's a good thing for markets and it's a good thing for competition. But we need to do that nationally. We need to build a national grid system where everybody can participate. In addition to having my geothermal, I have 2 state-of-the-art solar systems on my roof. My home is a power plant. I produce a lot more energy than I use. I ought to be able to sell that surplus back onto the grids and get market rates. But today, there are very few states where you can actually do that. And what we need to do is have a national unified grid and a national marketplace that does what a market is supposed to do, which is to reward good behavior, which is efficiency, and punish bad behavior, which is inefficiency and waste. Right now, we have a marketplace that is governed by rules that were written by the incumbents, by the polluters, to reward the dirtiest, filthiest, most poisonous, most destructive, most addictive fuels from hell, rather than the cheap, clean, green, wholesome, abundant, and patriotic fuels from heaven. And we need to change that dynamic around and rationalize our marketplace so that it serves us rather than hurts us. We need a market that will turn every American into an energy entrepreneur and every home into a power plant and power this country. Democratize our energy system because, you know, the political system of a country tends to reflect the economic system. And if the economic system is concentrated in the hands of a few people, you'll see the political system quickly devolve into plutocracy as well, or oligarchy. So to put the power source in the hands of tens of millions or hundreds of millions of Americans, you'll quickly see our system democratize as well. We have the power to do this. We've done this essentially before in our country. In 1979, we built an ARPANET system in our country to connect every American home to the internet. And the federal government paid for the creation of the ARPANET. They do that. They build infrastructure. They build canals, railroads, airports, and then commerce and national security follows. We did it in 1979. In 1980, a year later, the CEO of IBM said that personal computers were, quote, a dead-end technology. And a lot of other CEOs made the same point, made the same argument. For example, MCR, Dell, Honeywell, these are companies that are no longer in that business because they made the wrong bet. But today, most Americans have a PC. And what happened to the cost of information, of bits and bytes? It plummeted to virtually zero. And that's what's going to happen to electrons as soon as we build a national grid for electricity in this country. You want me to wind down?
Well, I think probably people have lots of questions to ask you.
Okay, let me like find the runway here. Okay, let me make these couple of quick points. We have a company called Cha-Cha. It's one of our portfolio companies. You may have heard of it. If you dial Cha-Cha 247-247 on your computer, on your cell phone, it will answer any question, usually within a minute. So I was showing it in China the other day to some Chinese friends of mine, and I said, ask me any question. And they said, what was Mao Zedong's favorite lunchtime meal? And I did it, and it comes back a minute later saying, spicy brown bean soup on pork fried rice. And I don't know if that's right or not, but it gave me an answer. You think about what that would have cost you a few years ago. Today it's free because we built a national grid that's a marketplace. It's free information forever. In 1996, we built a national grid for telecommunications in this country. Bill Clinton passed the Telecommunications Act, ordered all the baby bells to unify their lines, and everybody gets on. The lowest cost provider prevails in the marketplace. That triggered a telecommunications revolution in our country, and all these little gadgets we have now, like iPhones and iPads, are all the offspring of that revolution. What happened to the cost of telecommunications? It's plummeted to virtually zero. This morning I saw an ad by a company called Vonage, telecommunication company that promises unlimited overseas, local, and long-distance calls for $9. That's virtually free. I made a call 6 months ago from Miami to London, $74 for 5 minutes. That's the old way. The new way is free telecommunications forever. That's what's going to happen to telecommunications. That's what's going to happen to electrons as soon as we build a national grid for electricity. Right now, one of my companies, BrightSource, is building the biggest power plant in America, 2.7 gigawatt plant in California. It's a solar thermal plant that has a turbine on top of a scaffold, and it's surrounded by these giant rings of concentric rings of mirrors that are manipulated by computers to shine the rays onto that turbine. And that turbine, 20 minutes after the sun comes up, is at 750 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay. And we've got power purchase agreements with the two biggest utilities in California. It's 3 times the size of a nuclear power plant. We're building it in 3 years. The cost to build a coal plant is 10 years. To build a nuke plant, 30 years. The cost of building a nuke plant, $15 billion a gigawatt. The cost of building our plant, $3 billion a gigawatt. So for 1/5 the cost, you can get your energy for solar. The cost of building a coal plant, $3 billion a gigawatt. But once you build our plant, it's free energy forever because the photons are hitting the earth every day for free. All we have to do is build the infrastructure to pick them up and put them in the lines. Once you build a coal plant, now you got to cut down the Appalachians, ship them across the country, destroy the roads, warp the railroads, poison every fish in America, poison all of the 1 out of every 6 women, 640,000 children, etc. Once you build an oil plant for the same $3 billion, now you've got to go over to Saudi Arabia, punch holes in the ground, bring up the oil, refine it expensively, genuflect to the sheiks who despise democracy and are hated by their own people, get in periodic wars that cost $4.3 trillion, escorted across the Atlantic with a military escort that, guess what, Exxon doesn't pay for, you and I do. Spill it all over the Gulf, spill it all over Valdez, burn the oil and poison everybody in the country. So the real costs begin after you build that plant. Here's the math. We have 500 gigawatts of carbon-based power at peak demand in our country at 2% growth over 50 years, which is the life of a power plant. You have to double that. So we need to replace, to completely decarbonize America, we need to replace 1,000 gigawatts. At $3 billion a gigawatt, that's $3 trillion, which is less than the cost of the Iraq War. And it's not that easy, but it's easier than making a war in Iraq. And it's cheap because we can pay for it with the $750 billion that we're, in 4 years, with the $750 billion that we're now going to be saving from sending all that money abroad. Just let me say one last thing, and I have a bunch of crap that I wanted to tell you, but particularly being here at the University of Chicago. But I want to say that it's just about free market capitalism. I believe, and I've said the same thing for 30 years, that the free market is the best thing that could happen to the environment, because in a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. But in a true free market promotes efficiency, and efficiency means the elimination of waste, and pollution is waste. And a true free market would encourage us to properly value our natural resources, and it's the undervaluation of those resources that causes us to use them wastefully. And as I said, in a true free market, if you want to get rich, you got to make everybody else rich too. But what polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else. And they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay his production costs. That's what all pollution is. And the 28 environmental laws that we passed after Earth Day 1970, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, et cetera, are all intended to restore free market capitalism in this country by forcing actors in the marketplace to pay the true costs of bringing their products to market. And what we do as river keepers, we go out and sue polluters. We have 200 river keepers, but we don't even consider ourselves environmentalists. We're free marketeers. We go out into the marketplace to protect and safeguard the integrity of America's free market capitalism by catching the cheaters, the polluters, and saying to them, we're going to force you to internalize your costs the same way that you internalize your profits. Because as long as you're cheating the free market, it distorts the whole marketplace. And none of us gets the advantages of the efficiency, the prosperity, and the democracy that free market capitalism otherwise promises our country. And what we have to understand is that as Americans, and particularly here at the University of Chicago, is there's a huge difference between free market capitalism, which makes a nation more efficient, more prosperous, and more democratic, and the kind of corporate crony capitalism, which we've now embraced nationally, which is as antithetical to efficiency, prosperity, and democracy in America as it is in Nigeria. And you hear the Tea Party and all of these guys talking about how big government is a threat to democracy, and I agree. It is a threat, especially when it tortures people, when it puts people in black prisons, when it kills Americans without trial, when it suspends habeas corpus, when it listens to people 300,000 phone calls a year illegally, opens people's mails. That's a threat to democracy. Goes and looks at what books you rented at the library. That's big government. That's a threat to democracy. But the real threat to democracy comes from excessive corporate power. And if you look throughout American history, the most visionary political leaders, Republicans and Democrats, have warned Americans against excessive corporate power. Teddy Roosevelt said that America would never be destroyed by a foreign enemy, but that our beloved democratic institutions would be subverted by malefactors of great wealth who would steal them from within. Dwight Eisenhower said, a Republican, said in his most famous speech ever, warned Americans against the domination by the military-industrial complex. Abraham Lincoln, the greatest Republican in history, said in 1863, at the height of the Civil War, I have the South behind me and I have the South in front of me and I have the bankers behind me. And for my country, I fear the bankers more. And Franklin Roosevelt said in World War II that the domination of government by corporate power is, quote, the essence of fascism. And Benito Mussolini, who had an insider's view of that process, said essentially the same thing. He complained that fascism should not be called fascism, it should be called corporatism, because it was, in his words, the merger of state and corporate power. And what we have to understand is that the domination of business by government is called communism. The domination of government by business is called fascism. And our job is to walk that narrow trail in between, which is free market capitalism and democracy, and keep big government at bay with our left hand, big business at bay with our right. And in order to do that, we need a free and independent press that's willing to speak truth to power, which we don't have in this country. And we also need an educated public that can recognize all the milestones of tyranny. And that is your job. So.